Hi, and welcome to NCBA's Coffee Break, where we serve up conversations on the latest trends, challenges, and opportunities impacting the creditors' rights and financial services legal community, one cup of coffee at a time. I'm your host, Nathan Willner. Today, we're stepping outside the traditional law firm perspective and into the world of credit unions. Joining us is Anson Adams, Managing Legal Counsel at Truliant Federal Credit Union, one of the nation's largest regional credit unions. Anson's career has taken him from debt collection litigation and creditors' rights work to overseeing legal compliance and regulatory matters for a major financial institution. We'll discuss the transition, what makes credit unions unique, and what outside counsel should know when working with them. Welcome to NCBA Coffee Break, Anson.
Hey, Nathan, thanks for having me. Good to see you again.
Yeah, excited to have this conversation. Your career path has taken you from debt collection litigation to serving as managing legal counsel for a large regional credit union. What were some of the key experiences and lessons that prepared you for that transition, and what attracted you to the credit union industry?
I think the almost 20 years I spent practicing law prior to coming over to Truliant, all aspects of being a litigator really helped me. When you litigate, you have to really focus on, communication, whether it be, with your clients, with opposing counsel. And in-house, I found that that is the biggest skill, the most important skill because, when you serve as an in-house counsel, you're communicating all across the credit union, every single day. Um, and while my responsibilities, primarily do, touch on the recovery side, the collection side of things, that's not all of my job now. So instead of just being singularly focused on recovery efforts, it could be, there was a situation that took place in a branch. There could be a question from HR. It could be, we're dealing with a data breach or, something, along those lines. So it's, being a practicing litigator for almost 20 years, just, everything involved in that really helped me make that transition. But I do tell, anyone that asks that, having the skills and being able to communicate is definitely the most important thing. As far as what attracted me to the credit union space, I grew up a credit union member. My mother, she's retired, retired school teacher. So we use the big credit union in North Carolina, one of the second largest, I believe, in the country, which most teachers in North Carolina used. And, they were there for my family. They so for me, when I had an opportunity to move over into the credit union space, I thought it would be a great fit for me because I had represented both large financial institutions, more regional financial institutions, as well as both smaller or larger credit unions in private practice.
Yeah, so it's always interesting to hear how legal careers evolve. I mean, many attorneys start with a vision of where they'll end up, and then somewhere between, their first motions hearing and thousands of emails, life takes a different turn. And fortunately, legal skills tend to travel well, even if your title changes from litigator to counselor to strategist. So it's exciting to see how you made that transition. Moving from litigation into a role involving compliance, governance, and regulatory oversight, that is, though, a significant shift. What were the biggest learning curves when you made that transition, and what compliance and regulatory pitfalls should lawyers new to the credit union space be especially mindful of?
I think with the transition, one of the first things you realize, when you're in law firm life, most of your colleagues are attorneys or they're paralegals who, have been involved with the law. Your most of your conversations are attorney to attorney. Um, when you move in-house, regardless of the industry, I mean that completely changes. I look at, who I deal with now, who I speak with now on a daily basis, and it could be, my chief, who is very experienced in the, been in the financial industry for a long time, extremely knowledgeable, or it could be, a teller from a branch, reaching out with a question, and this is someone who's just out of school. So, um, I say the wide audience of people that you deal with, internally is really one of the the biggest differences I see there because you are dealing with and working with colleagues that come from a variety of backgrounds. So
Yeah, I mean, definitely, but it's all compliance kind
yes,
of geared. And one thing I've learned about compliance professionals is that they're often judged by things that never happen.
yep.
If litigation goes well, everyone sees the victory. If compliance goes well, nobody notices because there wasn't a regulatory issue, enforcement action, or headline in the first place. In many ways, success means being wonderfully boring, doesn't it? I mean,
It does. It does. In fact, I was just I sit next door to our senior director of fraud prevention, who's also our BSA officer, and she and I were having that same discussion the other day that in our line of work, sometimes when they don't hear from us, it means things are going well. It means that we're not having compliance and regulatory problems. It means that our fraud losses are down. So yeah, you're right. Sometimes that is a good thing.
yeah,
Um, as far as from the compliance, um, and regulatory side, what I see, I mean, fraud is rampant right now. That is something that I feel like, every financial institution is dealing with on a daily basis. Data privacy is another big thing. You know, look at how, since I've been practicing for a little over 20 years now, how everything's changed. I mean, the amount of data that goes back and forth between vendors and institutions and our members is huge. So
yeah,
that is one area you have to make sure that your systems there, your policies and procedures are in place, to make sure that you're protecting your members because as a financial institution, we hold so much personally identifiable information. And we all know from litigating, especially people in our industry that that is one thing you have to protect. Every state has a law about what PII must be redacted when you file a lawsuit, et cetera. But for us, being we are the protectors of it, and that's something that as a financial institution we do take very seriously. So um, that is one of the other things. I would say the third thing, I think that for looking at it from a regulatory compliance standpoint, there is embracing AI. You and I were just at a conference, and almost every session we went to was about AI. I was, telling someone recently that I've been to three conferences in the last year. All three of them were completely different, different audiences. One was, NCBA. One was a credit union collections professionals conference, which was just focused on credit unions, and it was, mostly managers up to VP chief level, who were involved in the recovery side. And then the ACC, in-house counsel event we attended, and all three of them different audiences, 60, 70, if not more, percent of the ed sessions are about AI now. So I think
yeah,
that, being ready for that, being able to both embrace that, but, understand the compliance and regulatory risks around that.
yeah. And when you mentioned fraud and those kinds of issues, just like AI is changing literally minute to minute, the different scams or frauds or different things that are going on is also changing. So I guess a big piece of what you're doing is being proactive, keeping your finger on the pulse of what's out there, and then trying to make sure your company has the resources in place to protect the customers. But again, that's a very daunting task,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I'm sure it keeps you up at night sometimes.
It does.
So, many people, including some lawyers, are familiar with, national banks, but may not be fully understand how credit unions differ. From a legal, regulatory, and business perspective, what are the most important distinctions between a credit union and a national bank, and how do those differences affect the way legal counsel supports those organizations?
Yeah, so I kind of look at this question, almost as a two-part question. Um, you know, the first, addressing the differences between banks and credit unions. We don't have clients, credit unions have members. Credit unions, most of them started off very small, and some like, ours have just grown because, we've realized over the years that we can take the member focused experience and bring it to a larger audience. And by doing that, we can give our members even more. We have more resources. We're able to better serve our membership. And I think the member-centric focus, I know at least, at Truliant and the other institutions that I work, I communicate with, it really is all about the members. The credit union space is also very collaborative. I mean, I think it would be hard for us to imagine, three or four of the largest national banks getting on a call together to discuss strategy and, talk about because, they're competing with each other. Their branches are typically across the street from each other. But for us, it's the credit union space is very collaborative. I mean, I'll never forget when I first started, I had a VP tell me, like, why don't you reach out to this person at this institution? And I was like, really? They're going to give us that? Wow. Like, and I think that's just, comes from, law firm world where, it was a lot more of a competitive area, whereas credit unions, even nationally are, tend to be very collaborative. I mean, we have a very strong listserv of credit union attorneys that's very active, and we bounce ideas off each other all the time. So I feel like that's one space where the credit unions differ from banks. I mean, credit unions are, we are nonprofits, so we have a bottom line to manage in the sense that we have a responsibility to our members and a budget to keep, but we also, we're also not looking necessarily at profits. So we are able, we do have a little bit more, I guess, I don't know if latitude's the best word, but, we are making sure that, instead of profit first, it's always, member first, member experience first.
Yeah,
Um,
and and one thing I want to kind of jump in and say that, you know, the North Carolina Creditors Bar Association had their meeting over at Truliant in Winston-Salem in your really beautiful headquarters and campus. And one of the things that I even mentioned to you at the time was how darn nice the folks that work there are and how customer service oriented they are. I mean, I was like, I felt like a VIP and they didn't even know who I was. And it was, and I really see that difference must carry through in everything you do and why Truliant's members are so lucky to have that kind of, care and concern among the customer service base and the tellers and the folks that work there. Was really impressive. So that was just an outsider coming in, not
yeah,
knowing anything, and I'm sure that carries through in everything you do.
it's the culture. It is definitely, at least with us, it's a culture thing. It starts at the top with Todd Hall, our CEO, and down through, the Chiefs, and it's an expectation, and it's like the old thing, saying it, if you see somebody in a bad mood, then you can inherit their bad mood or you can give them your good mood. And we have a I see it every morning, as I take the stairs up to my second floor office. If you see someone without a smile today, give them yours. And
Yeah.
it's nice seeing that, every morning as you walk in. And that really, to me, does kind of embody our mission, our culture. Um, so we really do try to give that. And it's nice to know that that's noticed. Then, to answer the second part of your question, kind of getting a little bit more into the details about it. So, the regulatory bodies are different, um, between credit unions and banks. Well, with a caveat. So, you have NCUA, who regulates instead of CFPB until a credit union hits a certain asset size. It's currently 10 billion, which we are approaching. We have an ongoing merger that's going to put us a little over 6 billion. We think we'll be, probably hit 10 billion in the next couple of years, whether it be organically through other possible, mergers. Our CEO is always, talking. He has very big aspirations, which is great. To be in a growing, thriving institution. But for credit unions, when you do hit that limit, like I say, right now, 10 billion, you do switch over from NCUA to CFPB. So, with that, it's, you're knowing your regulators, knowing, their regulations, I mean, in NCUA and CFPB, it's two different bodies. So, they're going to approach things a little bit differently. So,
Yeah, no, and I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions in financial services. On the surface, consumers see checking accounts, loans, online banking, and credit cards and assume everything is operating from that same playbook. But behind the scenes, the legal structure, mission, governance model, and regulatory framework can be really different. And those differences, often shape how legal departments assess risks and, make decisions.
yeah,
So, that's a big thing to keep an eye on.
it is. And like I say, I mean, that goes into we're not in the business, especially credit unions in general, especially Truliant. We're not in the business of selling products per se. We are there to help our members, and we want to sit down with our members. We offer a lot of financial education. We do outreach into communities that have been underserved. With financial resources. And especially with the education piece. That's one things credit unions I feel like do an exemplary job of, helping to educate those, who haven't been, privileged to have, some kind of financial education. And, whether it's just from some of the basics, as far as, setting a budget to really getting into like starting to invest and plan for the future, plan for, kids, grandkids, college, a major purchase down the road that may be, coming. So that is one thing with us, is we want to look at that member and see what can we do to help them? What can we do to
Yeah.
help improve their financial situation? Because, if you have a financial institution full of very financially healthy members, then the institution is going to be healthy.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of looking at it. I mean, for many of our listeners who work in creditors' rights and collections, bankruptcy, and financial service law firms, firms looking to work with credit unions, where do you see the greatest opportunities today? And what would should attorneys understand about, states' credit union landscapes, the regulatory environment, and the member focus culture before approaching local credit unions for, as potential clients? Like, what do they need to know?
It's all about the members. It really is. It's when I look at the outside counsel that I use, especially for our recovery efforts, I want to know how that, that's to me is like, how are you going to treat our members?
Yeah.
Sure, you can go collect the dollars. I mean, there's, we can all file a lawsuit and do that, but it's when I interview firms, if I onboard firms, the firms I have, you know, consistent, ongoing relationships with, obviously they're going to be firms that do the legal part the right way. But for us, it's that extra little bit of knowing, like, when that member calls in, how's our member going to be treated? And I
Yeah.
feel like, myself and those that are in my position, at other credit unions across the country, that is one thing we look at with our outside counsel is,
Yeah.
not just dollars collected, but, you know, um, making sure that our members are being treated the way that, we expect our members to be treated.
Yeah, it's almost counterintuitive with all the technology out there. You would think that that would draw potential members away from this, maybe the more friendly atmosphere of a credit union, but it's just the opposite. I think that
Mhm.
people really are really crave that personal attention and need that personal attention that we've forgotten used to be part of the way banking and
Yeah.
customer service operated, and it's a really valuable a valuable service to your members and to people just in general because maybe their lack of understanding of financial services, and they really rely on their financial institution to kind of have their back, and with
Yeah.
credit unions, it's really obvious that that's what goes on. So anyway, before we get to the end of our cup of coffee, so to speak, what emerging legal or regulatory challenges do you believe credit unions should be preparing for over the next few years? How can outside counsel best position themselves to help?
I do. I think, obviously, um, right now the CFPB, a lot of the enforcement has been, I mean, every time you have a new administration, it's going to change. So I think, when the next election cycle comes around, we have to be prepared. I know I was at a CLE recently, and the best advice I think for financial institutions is don't change anything as far as, from the regulatory standpoint, keep the stringent controls in place. Same thing with, our outside firms, our NCBA firms doing debt collection. We don't know what's going to happen. Every 4 years, the organization, the CFPB, NCUA, whoever can flip. So I think, for their, maintaining the current regulation, that we've all had in place. Again, I think fraud and data privacy are going to be huge. Protect our information because we
Yeah,
are transmitting, especially with our NCBA firms, we're transmitting a lot of PAI to them. So they have to their data has to be as secure as it is with us. And that's something I know our firms do a great job of. Um,
yeah,
and I think too, just looking, with AI trends, knowing, the technology, like, we said, it's changing seemingly overnight. So
yeah. So yeah, a lot to keep.
those are the things that I really focus on from when I look at, what with our, on the recovery side with our outside, counsel. Those are the kind of the things I see really changing in the next couple of years.
Yeah. But I think the one common thread is going to be a customer service focus, empathy towards the parties that you're dealing with, and really taking it seriously, as you move forward. So Anson, thank you, for joining us today and sharing your insights on legal leadership, regulatory compliance, and the evolving role of credit unions in today's financial services landscape. It's been really a wonderful conversation, and I know our listeners will walk away with a better understanding of both the opportunities and challenges facing credit unions and the attorneys who serve them. So thank you everyone for listening to this episode of NCBA Coffee Break. If you've enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review and share it with colleagues. Until next time, I'm Nathan Willner. Keep the coffee hot, keep the regulators happy, and remember, the best legal problem is the one you never have to litigate. Thank you to today's guest, Anson Adams from Truliant. It's been really great, and I'm sure we'll have you back to talk a little bit more about other areas and other emerging trends. But for now, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on another episode of NCBA Coffee Break. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thank you.